What would you think if I told you that the war you are currently watching on the news is actually between the wrong countries? You see the American and Iranian flags on the screen, you watch where the missiles fall, and you believe that the world is being dragged into fire because of these two countries. But what if I told you that Iran is just a pawn on this massive chessboard? There's a much bigger player waiting silently in the background, the real target, and everyone is avoiding mentioning their name. Today, we will talk about the actual truth that will emerge when the smoke of the missiles clears, because this war is not truly between two countries, it is part of a larger global competition. We called it the greatest power struggle of our century because we are facing literally two giants. On one side stands the United States of America, the undisputed leader of the current global system, and on the other is China, growing silently but incredibly fast, wanting to change the rules in its own favor. The competition between these two countries is not just a simple race about who has more tanks or planes. This is the multi-dimensional war over who will determine the future language, trade, and rules of the world. Well, you might ask, what does all this have to do with the explosions in the Middle East? It does, because every great power has a soft underbelly, and China's soft underbelly is its terrible dependence on what keeps it standing: energy. Think about China's economic miracle, a massive country where billions of people live, positioned as the world's factory. However, this massive factory needs an unimaginable amount of energy to operate continuously, and its own internal resources are never enough for this. At this exact point, that critical country on the map comes into play: Iran. Iran is one of the countries with the world's largest oil reserves, and despite all those heavy international sanctions, it is China's most important and cheapest energy supplier. Imagine for a second if America wanted to cut the energy veins of its greatest global rival. Would it attack China directly, or would it target the country from which it buys the most oil? Whoever controls energy controls not only the oil wells, but also a massive economy that revolves around that energy. The geography where this vital energy transfer takes place makes things even tenser. A huge part of the world's oil has to pass through a narrow passage called the Strait of Hormuz. Iran may control one side of this strait, but the actual military dominance over the waters belongs entirely to the United States Navy. America's massive aircraft carriers are not waiting in those waters just to show off. They are there to remind the whole world that they can cut off that vital energy flow to China with a single order when necessary. In other words, America holds the potential to squeeze its greatest rival's throat from a distance by using this massive advantage it has over energy routes. In fact, the war between these two giants had already started years ago, not with bombs, but with customs duties. For years, we have been watching a trade war between America and China that has become increasingly intense. The massive taxes they imposed on each other's products, the heavy sanctions on technology firms, and the production competition in global markets were actually the footsteps of a much larger storm. This war is certainly not just a military matter, it is an economic life-and-death struggle at its heart. Years ago, China launched the largest project in history to reduce its dependence on the American market and build its own economic empire. When we look at the root of that massive project, the same region appears before us again. You have probably heard of this massive plan that China calls the Belt and Road Initiative, the construction of a modern Silk Road connecting Asia to Europe and Africa, consisting of billions of dollars worth of ports, railways, and highways. This project is China's plan not only to sell its own products to the world, but also to become the new referee of global trade. One of the critical countries on the land route of this massive trade network is Iran, as you can clearly see when you look at the map. The Middle East forms one of the most important connection points for China in this project. Therefore, every large fire to be started in the Middle East actually means sabotaging China's historical project and cutting off that road. So in all this big picture, is Iran just a poor, passive pawn? Not exactly. Iran is trying to survive through multi-billion-dollar long-term strategic agreements it has made with China and needs China to breathe economically. China also needs a reliable partner in the Middle East that remains outside of America's control. For China, Iran does not just mean cheap oil, it also stands out as a very strong indirect balancing element against American hegemony in the region. In other words, Iran is not a simple pawn, but one of the most important strategic partners that China has put forward to protect its own king on this massive chessboard.
Not only oil and trade routes, but also the technology of the future is involved. There's a terrible technology race between America and China over artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, microchip production, and satellite systems in space. Future wars will no longer be won only in trenches, but in fiber optic cables and satellites outside the atmosphere. America can never tolerate China surpassing it in these technological fields. Therefore, pressuring China's allies militarily and economically actually means distracting the enemy in that great technology war and breaking supply chains. If you notice, two nuclear superpowers never fight each other directly. The American and Chinese armies never come face to face and fire bullets at each other, because that would mean the end of the entire planet. Instead, they use a method we know very well from the past: proxy wars. Great powers avoid fighting directly and carry out their competition through third countries. Attacks, sanctions, or military operations against Iran are the clearest examples of this indirect struggle. Since America cannot hit China directly, it sends a very painful message to it by targeting one of its most critical partners in the world. So how does China respond to this aggressive strategy? China has a very clear strategy filtered from thousands of years of state wisdom: never rush and never enter into direct conflict. Rather than using its military power as a showpiece, China prioritizes growing economically quietly. While America spends trillions of dollars on endless wars in the Middle East, China quietly builds ports, makes oil deals, and increases its power by taking zero risks. They are playing a long-term game with much more patience and making 100-year plans because they know very well that entering a war would destroy their own economic miracle. America's strategy is entirely based on stopping or slowing down this relentless rise. Washington uses every instrument at its disposal without hesitation to protect its current global leadership. It threatens China's energy routes, bans technology transfer, and tries to surround it with its allies, almost in a circle. The policy of pressure and containment is nothing more than an effort by America to keep this new rising power within the boundaries it can control. The latest crises in the Middle East should be read exactly as a very important part of this great encirclement operation. All this ruthless competition is dragging us to a very dangerous point towards a new global blocking. The world is gradually becoming bipolar, and countries are quietly being forced to choose sides. On one side stands the American dollar, American technology, and the Western alliance, while on the other side is Chinese capital, Chinese technology, and Asian countries integrated with them. This is exactly what they call the new Cold War. Countries like Iran face the danger of collapsing with a tremor at any moment or turning into a battlefield because they stand right on these massive fault lines. Because this competition is not just a distant foreign policy issue that concerns two countries, this situation directly affects your life. The sudden spike in energy prices, the doubling of the prices of the electronic goods you buy, the disruption of global trade balances, and economies entering an inflation spiral are all the results of this great clash. In a world where two giants trample, there is unfortunately no possibility that the grass will not be crushed. A crisis erupting at one end of the world creates a butterfly effect that will directly inflate your shopping bill at the market through supply chains. That's why we must now learn to read the actual truth behind the events while watching the news. They will constantly tell you about a security crisis in the Middle East, dangerous regimes, or regional threats. They will explain the justified reasons for the apparent war for pages. But if you only read the events through a single country, you will never see the whole story. The Iran crisis is certainly not an independent event on its own. It is just a small scene of a much larger and more ruthless global competition that stretches from Asia to America and will reshape the entire world. Now let's go back to that big question we asked at the beginning of the video.
Is this conflict you are watching on the screen really just a local war between America and Iran? Or is it a brand new front opened in the Middle East deserts of the America-China competition? We are only watching the shadows fighting on the stage, but the hands holding that light are in much different places. Perhaps the issue is not just Iran or that geography. The issue is who will shape the future of the world. If you want to understand where the next move will come from, don't look at where the missiles fall. Turn your eyes to where the main players are waiting silently.